afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on debating the future of regulation. My name is Ní Chonaire. I lead BIT's work on consumer markets in the UK, and I'll be your chair for this very exciting debate that we're about to have. So this session is going to pit two excellent sets of speakers against one another to win your support as the audience and ultimately the judge. The motion that they will debate is: firms develop new ways to exploit our biases faster than regulators can adapt. Okay? And arguing for the proposition, we have James Plunkett and James Walker. So James Plunkett is Executive Director of Advice and Advocacy at Citizens Advice. He oversees their work to improve the experience they give their clients, including through the use of digital technologies and data analytics. James also leads functions including communications, external affairs, and policy research. James Walker is the founder and group CEO of Resolver.co.uk, the leading independent consumer resolution service. James launched Resolver in 2014 and has since helped over 22 million consumers to resolve £2 billion of issues for free. And for the opposition, arguing against the motion, we have Karen Croxson and Stefan Hunt. Karen Croxson is Head of Research and Deputy Chief Economist at the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. She leads an interdisciplinary team integrating economics, data science and behavioural science to analyse retail and wholesale markets, inform policy and improve FCA internal operations. And Stefan Hunt, he is the Chief Data and Technology Insights Officer at the Competition and Markets Authority. He leads a group of data scientists and engineers using rich data sets and complex analysis, particularly relating to digital competition and technology markets. And finally, we have the judges in front of us, the audience. So you have an active role in this session, so please do send in your questions, and momentarily I'll be asking you to vote. But just to set the scene a bit about what we're going to be discussing. So the debate, as you can see here, the motion is: firms develop new ways to exploit our biases faster than regulators can adapt. And I don't think, more recently, I thought David Halpern and Liz Costa so eloquently put this in their online harms report published earlier this year. The internet has transformed how we live, work and relate to one another. We can make friends around the world without ever saying hello, compare products from dozens of shops without leaving the house, or plan a date with a stranger without breaking a sweat. Overall, it has proven a powerful force for good, delivering significant benefits to the economy and to consumers in the form of greater choice, personalisation, and incredible convenience. Yet the characteristics of online environments, the deliberative design, and the ability to generate enormous quantities of data about how we behave, who we interact with, and the choices we make, coupled with the potential for mass experimentation, can also leave consumers open to harm and manipulation. And interesting patterns have arisen in consumer markets from a behavioural perspective over the past decade or so. And to give you three kind of quick examples. So let's take personalisation. As behavioural scientists, we know that personalising information is a very powerful way to get people to pay attention to it. But this is a daily feature now when we think about the ads that we see online, the personalised prices that we're offered. And how often does it occur that a friend is absolutely convinced their phone is listening to them because of the incredible accuracy of the digital targeted ads. So when it comes to something else like choice overload, ordering effects and chunking can help us overcome the urge to avoid the decision or to make better decisions. Many, if not most of us, are slaves to the might of Google search engines as well as other search engines when searching for information or trying to make a decision. However, we might not be making the most sophisticated of choices, given that when we're looking at our mobiles and browsing on our mobiles, we choose from the top 3 search results 70% of the time. And one last example, thinking about deadlines, they're an excellent way to motivate someone to complete an action like filing your taxes or paying a fine on time or buying an early bird ticket to a conference. However, they've been used in nefarious ways on lots of different kind of platforms. If you think about some hotel booking websites or ticketing platforms, they, in some instances, you see deliberate incentives to kind of to lure you into a false sense of urgency. So, How can regulators keep pace with the rapidly evolving online markets? How can they harness the power of the data that they collect? And how can businesses thrive while still playing by the rules? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking our panel of experts to debate and discuss in this session. So the way that this is going to work, as all good behavioural scientists do, they look at the baseline data. So shortly I'm going to ask you to vote on whether you are in favour of this motion or are against it. So we have an idea of what the sense in the room is. Next, each one of the speakers is going to have 7 minutes to state their case. And during this, please do offer your rebuttals, offer your comments, offer your additions to what they might have said. And then we'll have a moment to kind of reflect on your thoughts on this. Finally, each team will have an additional 7 minutes to round up, to rebuttal and offer any other clarifications. And we'll be very much sticking to time. I have been practicing my John Burko impression, so you may feel the wrath at some point. And Tom very kindly is going to be keeping us to time. Okay, so to kick us off, let me welcome James Plunkett, first speaker for the proposition. Okay.
Thank you. So 3 points, I guess, in favour of this this statement. This feels like university or debates again. The first, I think, is that it's been obvious for a very long time that this pattern plays out where a new exploitative practice emerges in markets. It's then picked up by charities like ourselves and others. And then it takes a very long time, typically, for the regulatory cogs to turn and for regulators to respond. We've seen that again and again over the years, and certainly over the 5 years that I've worked at Citizens Advice. That is the pattern that plays out, and we see that in our data. Lots of examples I could give of that pattern playing out, and the loyalty penalty being one of the most obvious recent examples, where, of course, energy companies, insurance companies, and others exploit our various inertias and tendencies towards inertia to charge us too much for our standard household bills. That's been running on for years, if not decades. Everyone now acknowledges it's a problem, and yet still action hasn't quite amounted to the scale of the problem to try and stop it. But also lots of other specific examples in telecoms, for example, where you keep paying for your handset, your mobile handset, even after you own the handset, and you keep being charged for that product, so essentially another version of the loyalty penalty. Again, those regulatory wheels are sort of slow to turn to crack down on exploitative practices like that. And lots of other specifics. So one of my most irksome sort of examples is subscription traps, where you sign up for a new subscription, often with a free trial. Often it's one click, extremely easy to sign up. And then, surprise, surprise, it's really bloody difficult to cancel the trap. You have to write a letter or go through some sort of painful process. And again, it's just a really obvious exploitative mechanism to try and trick us into parting with our money in ways that we later regret. So there's many of those examples, I think, that are pretty clear over the years where an exploitative practice emerges quicker than the regulators are able to then respond to that practice. And because we work a lot with regulators that are doing their best, I should add, we see those cogs turning slowly, and those of you that work at regulators will know it's a slow process to put in place responses, certainly if they're regulatory changes, or even if they're enforcement action. It's just a slow and drawn-out process that can take months, if not years. Second point I guess I'd make is this has become much harder because the pace of change, I think, is getting much quicker, and that's been touched on already. I'm not sure it would even be possible for regulators to act, even if they moved at their fastest possible pace, to respond to the kind of speed with which companies can now exploit consumers. I was reading an article the other day about Financial Times and their new online content platform, and they issued new deployments, so changes to their online content or the sort of underlying platform 100 times a week. And obviously at big companies, big tech companies in particular, it will be even quicker. They'll be making hundreds of iterations every week, many iterations every day, to the design of a website, to the design of an app, to the design of the way that a customer signs up to a new contract with them. So how on earth could regulators respond at that kind of pace Many of those changes will be quite small, but some of them will become exploitative because they'll be about misleading a customer to sign up with something or to part with their money or to clicking a button they didn't quite intend to. So I think there's a bigger point there, which is about just the sheer pace, whether it's even plausible for a regulator to keep up with the pace of change in these markets and the pace at which companies can exploit consumers. Also, I think a more sort of nuanced point that it's becoming harder to even distinguish between exploitation of our kind of behaviours and beliefs and so on, and just kind of fair enough ways of tempting us to part with our money. So some of the recent examples around websites that sell us tickets, where they have been caught popping up things that say there's only one of these tickets left, and it's not true. There's more tickets left, but it lures the consumer into saying, oh God, I better buy that ticket to the theatre or that ticket on a plane, because this website is telling me there's only 2 seats left. And sometimes that's just directly misleading, and so regulators can enforce. But the boundary between what is really illegal and requires enforcement action and what is completely misleading and exploitative versus what is just sort of pushing the boundaries and just tempting you to part with your money, I think is increasingly unclear. So that also makes this, I think, much harder. And it pushes this shift towards kind of more outcomes-based regulation or more principles-based regulation that many of the regulators are sort of considering at the moment. Last point I was going to make is just around public faith in markets. And I think the other piece of evidence for this proposition is that the public have started to notice that regulators aren't able to act quickly enough. Really interesting data that may have been covered already today around the thinning faith that the public have in markets to give them good outcomes. And you see this particularly in the kind of global opinion surveys that Pew and others do, where across the world, and particularly in the Western world, there is this declining faith in markets when you ask people, do you have faith that markets deliver good outcomes for consumers, but also in other ways for workers and other ways too? Those results are declining, particularly into the late 1990s, 2000s and beyond. So the public have picked up, I think, on the truth of this proposition that at the moment companies seem to be able to exploit them more than they could in the past, and the government doesn't seem to be doing the job, including through regulators, of protecting them against that. So I think I'd kind of argue for this statement, but probably go a bit further and say it's pretty clear from the history that this is the case. I think it's getting harder for regulators to keep up and almost getting to the point where entirely new approaches are needed, because I don't see how regulators could even keep up given the pace of innovation now. But also I think just the cost and the importance of not solving this problem and the importance of doing so has gone up, because I think the public faith and the sort of the shift in the political mood is being driven partly by this failure to react to these problems quickly enough on the regulatory side. So that is my pitch, which James will now, I guess, build on. Thank you.
James, you want to go first? Is that okay?
Oh, we'll go over.
Yeah.
I'll stop trying to change.
Karen, welcome. Yeah.
Is it one on? Back and forth. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Aislinn. And thank you very much, James, my teammate Stefan, all of you here, obviously the organisers for this great opportunity to take part in this important debate. Stefan and I are going to set out some key arguments against the motion. I want to kick off by explaining why it does actually touch on a genuine concern, but I'll go on to argue that it's too pessimistic. So why does it raise a real concern? Well, consumer decision-making is hard, not least in financial services. Think about the complexity, the uncertainty, potentially high-stakes decisions, lots that potentially can go wrong. Then we have sophisticated firms with big data, data science, increasingly also behavioural science. It would be naive to underestimate the risk that our biases will be exploited, whether deliberately or inadvertently. And of course, we're always particularly concerned for the most vulnerable. They may face extra risks in this world and need extra protection. And I just want to emphasize the scale of the challenge for us here. The competitive landscape is vast. At the FCA, we regulate well over 50,000 firms. They're operating markets that are evolving rapidly. But why is it too pessimistic? I'll give 3 reasons. The first is actually our current toolkit and approach. We have mechanisms today to identify harm scientifically, and we take strong action where needed on evidence. We're a competition regulator at the FCA. We regularly analyse entire markets using vast data and sophisticated methods. We assess the harm and then design interventions. Behavioural science is integral to this toolkit and has been now for many years. We often have biases in mind. To mention just one example, we studied the market for add-on insurance. Think here about buying motor insurance and then being offered optional recovery in the event of a breakdown. So firms were using pre-checked boxes for this, okay? So defaulting us in to the optional deal. Now, this could be really convenient, but we estimated after analysis that this was really costing consumers. People were failing to opt out enough. Most of us suffer from default bias and just kind of stick with what's in front of us. It's a way to simplify decision-making. So we intervened to ban the practice, but not lightly, of course. The decision was based on robust evidence from a wide range of sources. This included behavioural lab experiments. Now, Stefan's going to take you through another case in great detail, one he worked on at the FCA. There we introduced a price cap on payday loans, and this dramatically reduced the total charges and fees that borrowers faced in this market. Now, this is an outcome control measure. It's a particularly strong intervention designed to protect the vulnerable. And again, the remedy was evidence-based, utilising, in this case, vast unique data from across the entire market, state-of-the-art statistics. You'll hear much more, but I really hope you'll find the story interesting. It exemplifies, for me, the lengths we'll go to build evidence forensically. And once we've intervened, the work doesn't stop. We monitor the market, evaluate the impact of the remedies. We're actively learning and improving. We're open, and we often collaborate with leading academics. So turning now to my second point, it's about innovation and some of our newer ways of working there. Firms are innovating all the time, and this can and does benefit consumers enormously. You heard a lot about that from Aisling. It's very compelling. But of course, new risks may arise, some potentially unforeseen. It's not too far-fetched to imagine in the future an AI pricing tool that simply learns to exploit the vulnerable as a way to maximize profit. Now, we're tech neutral at the FCA. Firms are accountable for consumer outcomes, whatever they're using, whether it's spreadsheets or AI. But innovation's critical for welfare, so we're not here to sit back and watch firms flounder. We're really active on fintech, here at home and internationally. We have a dedicated program to support positive innovation. We've pioneered new approaches, such as our regulatory sandbox. What is that? Well, firms can use this sandbox to try out new models in a live environment, but with safeguards in place for consumers and close support and up-close scrutiny. A firm might test a new investment advice app and receive live feedback on suitability. Our behavioural science unit, with many years of experience, might get involved and offer scientific support and insight from their side. We're supporting firms to identify vulnerable consumers and treat them appropriately. Increasingly, technology underpins this entire exercise. There's a rich audit trail to interrogate. And this brings me to my last point, about the future and fundamentals. The motion hints at an arms race. And absolutely we'll need to evolve and possibly reinvent some of our ways of working. But regulators are in a privileged position, and this is important to understand. We get to observe entire markets and then set the rules of the game. We can deploy the same cutting-edge techniques as industry, but on superior data. And as digital footprints grow, so too does this vantage point. At the FCA, we're integrating economics, behavioural science, and machine learning to exploit big data, to spot patterns, test hypotheses, and deepen our understanding of markets and behaviour. This capability, social data science, if you like, may even save us from our limitations one day. What if we could predict risk of vulnerability? What if we could design nudges to prevent people tipping into financial distress? What if we could use AI to estimate behavioural parameters and then design personalised policy? And of course, smart algorithmic advice may have a much bigger role in our futures, liberating us from complexity, from some of these biases. But then we need to understand the quality of the advice. And we need to unpack trust in algorithms and data sharing. There may be other biases that emerge, algorithmic aversion, algorithm appreciation. Algorithmic fairness, of course, is a potential concern. So there's a fascinating, challenging agenda around this, and we're working on many, many questions like these in our research program. But of course, it's not all about the data and the tools. It'll take more than that. Can we really compete on talent? Well, big tech, leading banks, they're hiring some excellent people, of course, and some of these people are doing excellent work. But some brilliant minds are also attracted to an entirely social mission. And we won't be working in a vacuum either. We're joining up across the ecosystem on some of our toughest priorities: consumer vulnerability, financial crime, cultural change in financial services. So whilst the motion absolutely speaks to a real concern, I've given three reasons to be cautiously optimistic. Effective toolkits today, new programs to address risks as they emerge, fundamentals for the future that favour effective regulation. And it's a journey, of course. We can't be complacent. But I hope Stefan and I can convince you that this is far from a hopeless situation. Thank you for listening.
I thought we were going to win £100, so I'm a little bit disappointed with the whole, we actually only just win a vote. But anyway, that aside, it's not about the money, it's about the outcomes. I don't think the future is negative because I think every problem can be solved. I don't believe that businesses are actually out necessarily to do the wrong thing. I do think businesses can move faster than government. That great orator, Donald Rumsfeld, once said, there are knowns, there are unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. I also don't believe I was ever going to quote Donald Rumsfeld in my life to an audience, so this is a unique moment. I think the important part about that is that we can regulate what we know, and we can probably understand what we don't know. But we cannot regulate or come up with regulation on unknown unknowns until we know either about them by knowing them or realizing that there is an unknown element there. That is where the problem exists, is that this does not mean that we have a dystopian future. This does not mean that things do not work. But what it does mean is that there is a situation where the market can move faster, whether it is trying to or not, than a regulation can. And you know, it is shown by Greg Clark, who I think was former business minister, I'm not quite sure who is business minister at the moment, who wrote to the CMA to say, I think regulation as it stands will be dead in under 5 years. We are losing trust with markets. We are not growing as quickly as we need to do and being dynamic in what we deliver. We need to look at this and how this works. We need to look at actually how we support businesses. Let's take a really couple of good examples. So if you look, for example, at death rates in the construction industry in the UK and France, construction deaths in the UK are considerably lower. Why? Because it's not based on fines and it's not based on regulation, it's based on culture. If you go and look at the airline industry as well, what you'll see is that actually if a pilot does a mistake, he will admit it and tell everyone about it or a problem with the plane, because he will not be punished for doing it. The reason being is that you really want to make sure that you're not having anything hidden up when you've got a pilot who's flying you across the sky and turns out they've done something wrong. So it's actually about helping and supporting. That aside, we can see examples in the market of where things go wrong. I've been to prison once, luckily only as a guest, but one of the most interesting things about going around a prison was one of the prison officers said, yeah, the problem is that these guys sit around all day and have nothing else to do apart from think about how to do something wrong, i.e. smuggling a phone or whatever it may be. Businesses aren't sitting there going, how do I do everything wrong every day? But they are thinking about how that they improve what they deliver. And by improving what they deliver, sometimes a boundary can be crossed. James earlier referred to payday loans. Really good. Let's take a simplistic example of, I don't know, Wonga. Was Wonga doing something wrong, or was Wonga actually just going on a route of going, I've just built a really great technology that makes it easier for people to be able to take out a loan? Did they set out on a journey to go, actually, what I'm trying to do is to do something that I think is fundamentally wrong? Or did they go, actually, I'm trying to be better than my competitors? They created something that had a detrimental effect. Consumers turned around and went, this is really unfair. And they spoke to charities such as Citizens Advice. Citizens Advice would then go, hang on, this doesn't seem fair, and would therefore go and speak to the regulator or speak to government, who would then go and investigate. And out of the back of the investigation, the interesting bit is that what you create is a pendulum that swings. If it swings too far in one direction towards the business, it will end up swinging too far potentially in the other direction towards the consumer. So fairness is always what's being looked for within the market. The market is trying to be fair, and where the market isn't fair, you end up in a situation where it will try and correct itself. In between it occurring and the correction is where you have a detriment. That's what I would argue, and James would argue, and our side would be, is that actually the market can be supported. This is not a negative future. The issue exists is being able to know when there is an issue and how quickly you can react to it. And the time between knowing of something and reacting can be done. The not knowing about it cannot be done until you realize. Now, I've built a website, and we run a website that helps consumers, as was explained. I can see events happening quicker than they probably are seen in the market. So I don't know if you noticed last week, PPI finished and all the promotion of PPI. Santander's website went down. We know when Santander's website went down before anyone else probably apart from Santander did, because suddenly the number of PPI cases that went through our platform, Santander, went from a reasonable amount to skyrocketing. Because everyone went, it doesn't work, and they went somewhere else to look, and they found us. Now that's when you start to be able to see that actually technology can help to be able to give insight. A restaurant provider 2 summers ago had a problem with the quality of their burgers. Never hit the papers, no one knew about it. We did, because suddenly everyone raised an issue about the quality of the burger and how it fell apart. Lasted for about 6 weeks before it resolved itself. Actually, going back to that knowns and unknowns is that the way that regulation needs to move is about supporting businesses to be better, so they don't need to be in a situation that they get penalized, but also in a situation where actually they are focused on being supported to doing the right thing, but when the wrong thing happens, that it can be noticed quickly. I think the important part is that businesses, I don't believe, are out to do the wrong thing. Businesses are out to be able to drive and maximize shareholder value, because that's what they're there for. Regulators are there to make sure that they do that in the right way. Can the regulator ever be there before they start doing something wrong? Very hard. How do you predict the unknown? So, regulation will improve, regulation will become better, and it always is. And the way that companies are engaged is improving across all sectors, but that does not mean that companies are not doing effectively taking advantage, whether it be on purpose or not, of the consumer, because actually what they're trying to do is to deliver the best system. The best system sometimes comes at a compromise of ethics. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Really good to be here. So James raised some important points that we as regulators certainly need to be alive to. But the motion suggests that consumers are getting an increasingly worse deal. And I don't think that's quite right. As outlined by Karen, we've got legal powers and sophisticated regulatory capabilities. And on balance, I think we should be more positive. So the first reason, I think, to be optimistic is these regulatory capabilities. So I'm going to tell you about an experience of mine that Karen alluded to. So when I was at the FCA, I ran the analysis behind the Payday loan price cap. For those who don't know what Payday loans are, they're very short-term, very high-interest loans. So think 17 days, £250. We were really worried about the immediacy of Payday loans and that they played on behavioural biases, leading to real consumer harm, especially for people with low credit scores. So we used our information gathering powers to get data on all consumers and their borrowing. We went to the top 37 lenders to get details of all the loans made over a two-year period, a total of about 20 million loans. We added in credit scores for all consumers, and for about 2,000 people, we did really rich and detailed surveys, capturing everything else that was missing. This is borrowing from friends and family, from loan sharks, financial distress, anxiety, all these kind of things. With this really quite amazing data, we conducted cutting-edge analysis, advised by some of the world's top academics. So John Campbell, who was then the head of the Department of Economics at Harvard and a leader in household finance, advised us. Jonathan Zinman, who's a financial and methodology expert with a great knowledge of behavioural economics. We produced powerful results. Using regression discontinuity, we showed that individuals on the margin were indeed being harmed by payday loans and would be better off without them. We modelled, using complex matrix algebra and some non-parametric statistics, exactly how firms would adjust their lending based on the price cap. Ultimately, this analysis allowed the FCA to implement a price cap that really did bite. The analysis stood up to the highest level of scrutiny and challenge. In fact, it was published subsequently in a top journal. I use this example to illustrate a few points. First, authorities' legal powers allow us to put together unique data sets. These can include internal documents, board minutes, emails, even WhatsApp messages. We can get the designs of A/B tests and the results so we can really understand what's going on. These data sets allow us unrivaled insight into problems and potential solutions. Second, our powers allow us to take strong action. And we're actively working right now to strengthen our powers to be more fleet of foot and responsive, for example, through the CMA's reform programme. Third, our social mission is really attractive in allowing us to access the top minds in academia, often pro bono. We can understand the latest methodologies and techniques and keep our fingers on the pulse. Fourth, this social mission also allows us to recruit great talent. Many of the consultants who worked for me during the payday price cap, we subsequently recruited at the FCA. I see the power and attractiveness of the social mission from my current role when I'm assembling a team of data engineers and data scientists. So authorities have access to data and information, legal powers and capability that may surprise some of you. So from my experience is that the quality of the talent we're able to get is equal to those of large corporations, surpassed only by the biggest technology firms and the richest financial institutions. Now, these analytical capabilities are reflected in the work we do at the CMA to tackle exploitation of behavioural biases. So we've recently tackled online hotel booking websites. So the use of scarcity messages, actually that was alluded to earlier, buy now, only one room available, and other forms of pressure selling. We've taken them away. We've taken inappropriate use of reference points when it's coming to how discounted prices are. We've also focused on obfuscation around commissions in terms of how they determine ranking and listing. In secondary ticketing websites like Viagogo, and actually I noticed during the previous session, this just came up on the BBC front page today, we've agreed with Viagogo and they've finally taken down all of the issues that we've determined, and actually now the website for Viagogo is radically different to what it was previously. We've prevented gambling firms from marketing free gambles that were punitively complicated and very far from free. Now, this takes me to the second reason to be optimistic about regulators adapting in real time. We need to be balanced about what's going on in firms. So James already alluded to this, but there's certainly poor behaviour. There's certainly some prevalent and persistent poor behaviour, but very few people wake up in the morning intending to exploit, though of course some do. My own personal interest in behavioural economics stems from working in the headquarters of a large financial institution, where we were just making so much money, and the only way I could understand how much money we were making was that if people just didn't really understand what we were selling them. But it was not a deliberate and conscious effort to bamboozle, rather a more subtle and slow process of firms evolving their offering and responding to profit signals. We should also bear in mind that many firms are not as advanced as we think. The richest firms certainly have a jaw-dropping ability to acquire talent, but for many, the use of experimentation, machine learning, or artificial intelligence is still in its infancy. Most standard businesses aren't actually spending their time acquiring high-quality data on their customers, much less analysing it to exploit consumer biases. The notion suggests that the past was better than today, but snake oil salesmen were a feature of the 19th century, a time with much less regulatory infrastructure. We are no longer in the Wild West. Yes, there's many issues, but given our social mission, authorities have real advantages and continue to build and develop our capabilities. And that's the business that me, Karen, and our colleagues are in. And we're empowered in primary legislation by Parliament to get data and information that we need to take action. So yes, firms might be exploiting biases in new ways, but authorities can adapt, and we are adapting. I put it to you that you should be against the motion.
Great. So many topics and themes covered. So a couple of things just from my reflections. So some of the key issues that have emerged in the first James's talk is thinking about the loyalty penalty, subscription traps are key issues. Are there opportunities to instead think about outcomes-based regulation or performance-based regulation? Also really interesting point around the change in the trust in markets and when you see the data internationally. James Walker mentioned businesses aren't out to do the wrong thing, but they do move faster than government. Is there something that we can do there? Really interesting point that connects to an earlier session on the data that the Resolver collect. So you knew that there was an issue with Santander's website before anyone else did, much like the topics that were discussed earlier in Google Trends data. And Karen, you talked about kind of the breadth of the firms that you need to regulate. 50,000 firms covered by FCA. Thinking about the future of regulation, how you might be able to offer personalised policies, that kind of thing, and also the issue of talent recruitment and kind of the social mission. There does seem to be a big drive in getting real talent to regulators. And then on Stefan's point, so much on are consumers really getting a poor deal? Is that true? Is the motion kind of going too far? And then really interesting kind of learning a little bit more about kind of the payday loans analysis and thinking about the three key things that's in regulators' toolkit. So thinking about the unique data sets, thinking about the powers to take strong actions and access to the top minds. And going to the Slido, what questions have we got up here? So some reactions here that might be able to get up on the screen. So Dr. Croxson, your examples are good, but they don't address the delay lag during which many consumers were harmed, which I think is the debate question. Some challenge there. Online price discrimination based on behavioural and other data, should it be allowed? Should it be mandatory to disclose to consumers? What else have we got? To Stefan, your team's capabilities sound impressive, but you're not addressing the debate question, which is about speed relative to the market. Yeah, lots of different interesting things coming out there. Lots of challenge. So now each of the teams are going to have their final closing arguments. And this is quite a challenge to have to do it on the spot. But I know that we have willing and ready teams. So I'll welcome yourselves up first for the final 7 minutes. All right.
You can do one.
How do we do this?
Yeah.
You want standing up?
Should we do stand up together?
Whatever.
All right, yeah.
One microphone, one love.
So I think a few quick responses, I guess. So I guess on the optimism point, I am optimistic, so I don't want to kind of us to be branded as the pessimists in this debate. I think this can not be true in the future if we change things and become much bolder, but I think it is true today. And I do acknowledge there's lots of brilliant, talented people working at regulators trying to solve this. So I would completely concede on those points. I think though, just on the track record of the last decade or 2 decades, it just doesn't ring true to say that regulators have been able to keep up with things. If you think, even on the payday loans example, which we worked closely with the FCA on, really impressively quick, relatively quick response in that case, it still took, as you'll appreciate, just a long time before the regulator was able to gather the evidence and intervene. And in that period, tens of thousands of people came to us having had life-ruining, life-changingly bad detriment and debt that had caused all kinds of terrible problems in their lives. So even in that case, which I think is an admirably quick response, things were slower than people would need them to be. And in the case of something like the energy market, 18 years on, I think it was from privatisation, many people still hadn't switched in that entire 18-year period, and only by that point had the world accepted that just sending them another letter to nudge them to switch wouldn't be enough, and we ended up with a price cap to some of the points about oversteering. So I think there are many examples like that where reactions were not only too slow, but they were kind of wildly too slow in that kind of case. And I think just very briefly on the intentions point, I would never claim that people in these firms are doing this intentionally. I think vanishingly few firms set out intentionally to cause detriment. The problem is actually worse than that, which is that they are incentivized to cause detriment. And often if you spoke to those energy companies, they wanted to not be doing that. They wanted to not be overcharging people on standard variable tariffs, but none of them could stop doing that because everyone else was doing it. And so you get markets in these structural problems where everyone is having to rip off their customers because everyone else is doing it. And that's when it's the role of the regulator to act to break those kind of deadlocks. So I think I'd concede some of these points, but I think I would stand by the sort of central point. I'm not sure it's got worse, but I think that remains true today.
So what I would add on to that is that, first, let's read the question. Firms develop new ways to exploit our biases faster than regulators can adapt. I've not seen anything there about the past, the present, or the future. Well, actually, I see the present. So therefore, what's happened and what's going to happen is sort of outside of this debate. I think a couple of really good points are going back to the unknowns, is that how do we deal with something where we don't know what it is? And let's think back 5, 6 years, probably a little bit longer. What was fake news? Had anyone ever heard of fake news? And then there was an election and fake news was everywhere because it had been used. Well, is that not using our bias against us? And no one was aware of it. And yet, now we are starting to move about what can be done. So time goes on before something can be dealt with because it needs to be understood when something new appears. Regulation cannot move that fast. And also there exists a place where actually there is no regulation. So it's very fine for us to talk about finance, very fine for us to talk about energy. But take a sector where there is no regulation that exists. How can a bias be exploited? Well, it probably is, and it isn't noticed because no one is necessarily spending the time looking at it. Government has many things to do. Regulators have many things to do. This is a very wide conversation. This is a very wide topic. It's very simple to me. Organisations can move faster because government cannot look everywhere and government cannot understand what hasn't happened until it happens. Thank you.
It's proper sport debating again, isn't it?
So let us just make a few points just to round this out from our side. I think a number of excellent points made here. For us, I think it does make sense to think about a timeline, to think about the past, the present, and the future. I think that's meaningful when you think about welfare, the decisions that need to be taken, and the fundamentals that are really going to shape what works here for consumers. Are there examples of bad practice? Will there continue to be some issues in the future? Absolutely. What we're arguing here, I think, is that the fundamentals are really strong for effective regulation in the future, stronger than today, stronger than in the past. The plates are shifting in markets, frankly, and the net is really closing in on unscrupulous actors, but it's also creating an opportunity for us to help all of those firms out there that actually want to do the right thing by consumers, but may suffer unintended consequences from some of their best-placed innovations. Now, I want to just share a couple of quick anecdotes on hard sell experiences or pressured selling, just to really hammer home this point. One was a timeshare sales conversation in Mexico a couple of years ago when I left my husband for a moment at the airport, and he sort of struck a killer deal for a taxi, a really cheap taxi, and we ended up somehow in a long 2-hour breakfast conversation the next day about whether we would or wouldn't buy a timeshare in this part of Mexico. So that was really interesting. The other was about a walk-in bath, actually, for an elderly, vulnerable relative recently after she fell and broke her leg. And a lovely sales guy came into the home and spent hours with us talking through the options, played a video, all kinds of things. Now, look, in both these cases, we were talking about huge financial commitments. There was emotional priming, irrelevant bundling, things like a discounted vacation with the walk-in bath. And there was rampant scope for exploitation or for great support and assistance, depending on which way you want to look at it. But what did these things really have in common that matters? Well, both sales processes, they were entirely offline, okay? So 0 audit trail. Now, who can really say whether one interaction amounts to exploitation? You need more than just anecdotes. James Plunkett gave a nice example. You know, only 1 ticket left. You see that once, you see it twice. What does that really mean? Okay. Now, as big data floods in, the field is tilting in our favor. We're getting smarter about what really matters and what doesn't, what a pattern really is and what it isn't, okay? And we can bring theory and conceptual reasoning for that as well. So things like structural factors, prisoners' dilemmas, all of that, it'll get better understood in the future and not less well understood. Are we being too cautious, too rigorous in our work? I really appreciated the comment, could we be faster? Are we really hitting that point? Let me make a remark or two about that. So absolutely, we need to be fast. We need to be lean now and in the future, leaner and faster than we were in the past. But when we look at markets, sometimes these outcomes, they're turning on really subtle factors, structural differences. It would be naive to assume firms won't adjust and react to our interventions. We always need to take that on board. Latest theory, including from fields like behavioural industrial organisation, can really help there. And of course, data can help. Now, we're investing to give us more speed and dexterity in our work. Our new online trials capability at the FCA, it's giving us answers to some questions that previously would have taken months or years, and we can do more and do better there. And do you know what? This data, all this predictive power and analytics, it's going to help us prioritize our efforts more. Ashlyn, you reminded me about the scope of the challenge, the vastness of the universe that we regulate. In the future, we may be able to classify firms more scientifically. Who's really doing mostly the right thing, behaviourally, on evidence? Who's struggling to get it right and needs more support? Who's not even trying, needs much closer scrutiny, stronger engagement? Not gut feel, not guesswork, hard empirical evidence at speed. We can ramp up the surveillance where it's most likely to bite. We can dial it down where it's not needed and use those resources. I really agree with James Walker on the point about culture, by the way. That itself is open to broader and deeper scientific inquiry. There's a fascinating field emerging using linguistics as an honest signal of culture, big data, email trails to really start to shed some interesting light on how culture emerges, who assimilates, who doesn't, how problems can arise, and how a good culture really can be brought to bear on the provision of goods and services for consumers. And I think many firms want that, many people want that. At the end of the day, many of us really want to just come to work and feel like we've done the right thing and done some really good work. Finally, just to reinforce this message on talent, I think that desire to do the right thing among so many of us, it's really helping drive this cultural change already inside firms. It's inspiring positive innovation. Just look around you here in London in the fintech community. So much of it socially oriented. To improve the lives of millions. What an opportunity. So I'll hand over to Stefan now, but I just want to say in parting that absolutely we can't be complacent. Neither of us is for sure. But do you know what? The heyday for exploitation of consumers, either deliberately or inadvertently, it's really firmly behind us, okay? The future is about a shifting of the fundamentals. It's about more transparency, more insight. It's about stronger headwinds for those who would exploit our biases. The motion is too pessimistic, as stated.
Thanks. So I absolutely accept, as was stated, that there is a gap between what happens in firms and us taking action. I mean, that's necessary. There's uncertainty. We don't know where things are going to go. The motion as stated is effectively that gap is getting larger. And I don't quite think that's true. I think both firms adapting and regulators adapting too, and it's not clear to me that we're going in a worse direction. So, for example, we talked about all the changes that firms are making. Well, so right now I run a sort of data science and data engineering function, so we're able to take in very large swathes of data, and we're able to really understand and look for those signals earlier and better. So in my previous role, when I was at the financial regulator, we were able to build the first machine learning models which could predict, in some cases, which firms were going to do bad things or which individuals within firms might do bad things. So, of course, that's enabling us to have quicker reactions than we had previously. So it's not to say there's not issues, there absolutely are, but it just takes time. We're developing over time, and we're actually, I think, in some ways, reducing the time, certainly not getting worse. In terms of the cultural change, we can actually see that this can be a very large factor within firms. If we look at what's happening within technology firms right now, we can actually see sort of adaptation that seems quite similar to what I think we saw in financial firms sort of 5 to 10 years ago. So I think there are ways to make sure that firms are taking on these issues themselves and actually starting to deal with them. So I think that the motion, as stated, is too pessimistic.
Great. Excellent. So you've heard from all of the speakers now, and just to come back to some of the comments that are coming in through Slido. So some interesting questions here about what to do if harm has already occurred before regulation comes in. So this is particularly thinking about bias being exploited to target social media users to influence election results. What's the role of culture and reputational damage? And some interesting challenge as well to the motion. So I think we have the wrong debate question. It should be about what should the role of the regulator be in the future? And if regulation is too slow, what can we do? So, thank you all so much for participating. I'm now going to present, hopefully, can we get the Slido up on the screens? Excellent. So I'm first going to show the baseline for the polling. Hopefully we may be able to see the result in that. Excellent. Okay, so this is the baseline. So you had a hard battle to fight. So you see, 84% were in favour of the motion and 16% were against the motion. Okay, so now the final vote. Let's see. So you should have, if you go back to your Slido, you should have a new poll for the end line, and let's see how things change. Oh. It's a very dramatic movement. You can see the ticker going up. 51 votes. Still ticking up. Oh.
Real-time feedback.
Keep it going for another 10 seconds. Get your last votes in. Edging towards. This is the really interesting impact of having kind of like a low baseline and how you can move up. So have we got...
Exactly. It's actually easy for our side. It was so
I think you win, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think it's kind of slowing down now. So I think we started before, was it 19% or 16%? Can someone remember? Don't have it in front of me. But I think there's definitely been a closing of the gap. But there definitely does seem to be an overall majority in favour of the motion. Well done to everyone.
I think you win. You shifted the dial.
Love that.
It's not the winning, but the taking part.
Any final comments from either of the sides?
I think, the thing we've not talked about is the political economy of the thing. And there's been lots of debate about how we use evidence and so on. I think the point's well made that regulators need to gather sufficient evidence before you intervene, and that takes time. But I would say I would buy that argument more fully if there were lots of examples of regulators acting too quickly and then lots of examples of regulators acting too slowly. And for me, to be frank, as a consumer advocate, there are many, many examples of cases where action's been too slow. It's much harder to think of cases where regulators have moved too swiftly. And that, to me, speaks to the kind of politics of the thing, that there's just a massive amount of course, heat on regulators from industry, from firms, a huge amount of money spent lobbying for regulators to be slower, and rather less on the consumer side from charities and others. So I think that's the sort of, if there's an elephant in the room, it's around the sort of politics of intervention and some of that side of things, which goes beyond some of the evidence, I guess.
Okay.
So actually, just one thing on that. I wasn't good. So a very large online retailer that actually can charge you for once a year for a charge and then gives you free delivery, if you can work out who they could be. I was at an event and they were talking, and this guy did a very fantastic speech about how that they were improving the efficiency of delivery. And at the end, somebody put their hand up and went, I got charged $79.99 and I didn't know that I was going to be charged for it. I signed up for a trial and wasn't aware that I suddenly found that I'd got this money off my account. And the person standing went, well, that happens very rarely. And I went onto the database and looked up and put my hand up and went, well, actually, 38% of the cases raised against you are about exactly the same issue. So going back to that organisational thing, it's quite easy sometimes for organisations to present data to be able to say, actually, you know what, it's not what quite it seems, you know, building on James's point, and I'm not suggesting that they were, so I don't get sued. But you know, it's very easy sometimes for industries to be able to say, well, that's not quite as it seems. The hard bit is always going to be working out whether something is right or whether something is wrong. And it will always take the regulator time to be able to do that because it needs to be a fair intervention. The issue is always the question of what happens in the meantime.
Great.
Yeah. I think that's, you know, this is a really fair point and obviously a very important one. I think when a regulator intervenes, you know, you can think of this like from a decision theoretic point of view, you've got an asymmetric loss function, right? Because moving too quickly and getting it wrong, you know, try reversing that decision quickly, right? So there's harm the other way, and we must think about the counterfactual. So taking a little bit of time, just making sure that the evidence really stacks up, right, would withhold a legal challenge, actually is the right thing to be doing, the fair thing to be doing, I think does make sense. Can we move faster? I do think it's a timeline. You're going to see movement across it. I think there's actually a real risk here in talking about humans and biases of sort of over-extrapolating from the past. You know, so a regulator 20 years ago and a regulator in 20 years' time, completely different.
So I guess one thing that strikes me is the importance of really staying connected. So we talked about the gap, and there's always going to be a gap, but actually making sure, and we absolutely do, that we're talking to citizen advice, that we're talking to James, that we're talking to others. That's one very useful source of information. There's others too. Absolutely speaking to academics can be a very useful source of information. We talked about the payday price cap, so I'd certainly been talking to a bunch of academics in the years leading up to that, so we knew already the state of the literature very, very well, had already kind of designed potential analysis that we might do actually before we actually knew we had to impose a price cap, these kind of things. So there's making sure we have those conversations, that we get the intelligence, that we know the sort of theory, but the underlying kind of issues that might arise, and that we're actually looking for newer data sources as well. So just to use sort of one small example, so I've got a new team that I've alluded to a couple of times. One of the teams was actually been told about a particular issue. I can't say what the issue is internally, and they've been, you know, it sounded like it was something that was, you know, really might be something that we might be concerned about. So in this case, it did come from a consumer agency, the concern. Not citizen advice. And it's something we're genuinely concerned about. So it turns out that data was available online as a bunch of pricing data, but actually for a human to get it, it would take weeks, many weeks. So you could either try to get that data, or you could just rely on the qualitative information. So it turns out, in this particular case, one of the guys in my team, a data scientist, he got onto the website, looked at the source code, saw in the source code that there was a download button that had been disabled, enabled the download button, downloaded the data in about half an hour, and that actually really changed the nature of how we were able to consider. In that case, actually, it looks like the concern, when you actually got into the data, wasn't founded because some analysis that had been done wasn't actually, there were some mistakes in that analysis, but we were able to show through rigorous analysis and actually make sure that we made the right decision going forward. So I absolutely do think there's reasons to be optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and please join me in thanking the speakers for their contributions.